What's up guys, back with another Fallout 4 video, and today I figured it would be interesting to discuss Nora, or the player character's spouse in Fallout 4, and what would happen if he or she managed to live and not get shot by Kellogg during the very beginning of the game. In this video, I'm going to make the assumption that everyone else in Vault 111 dies with the exception of Nate and Nora. Instead of being shot by Kellogg, the player's spouse has her baby successfully taken away from them, and they are resealed in their cryopod, only to emerge 60 years later along with the player character. Assuming that, I'll be talking about some of the pros and cons of Nora or Nate's survival as a spouse from both a story and technical/gameplay perspective. One final thing before we start, but I'm aware that there is a mod for Fallout 4 that allows you to have Nora as a companion, and just so you guys know, that mod inspired the creation of this video. So if a mod that allows you to travel with Nora interests you, I will be providing a link in the description for both the PC and Xbox One versions. But I guess without further ado, then let's go ahead and jump on in and discuss how Nora's survival would affect the story. At first glance, you would think that having Nora live would greatly affect the story. While certain things would definitely be affected, I think the overall story arc that we saw in Fallout 4 Vanilla could be preserved. Perhaps instead of getting shot by Kellogg, Nora or Nate gets injected with some type of serum that makes them go to sleep so that the Institute can safely remove Sean without anyone getting hurt. And when the game itself finally starts 60 years later, I could see one of two things happening. The first thing would be that the player's chosen character, either Nate or Nora, would emerge from their cryopod in Vault 111, and instead of seeing their dead spouse, they would notice that their spouse is still frozen in their cryopod. So in addition to trying to find their own son Sean, the player would also have to figure out how to free his or her spouse from the cryopod. Ultimately, much like how we saw in Fallout 4 Vanilla, the player discovers that the solution to saving Nate or Nora as their spouse lies within the Institute, where it's discovered that their son Sean is located. And once the player reaches the Institute, they would still find Father, and then they would have to do things for Father and the Institute before they could get their spouse released from their cryopod in Vault 111. The second thing, which is far more likely, is that Father and the Institute release both parents at the same time. And much like we see in Fallout 4's plot, both characters attempt to search the wasteland together for their son. In my opinion, this second option fits more in line with Fallout 4's plot, as Father released the sole survivor from the vault just to see what might happen and whether they have the resolve to try and find their lost child or not. Since both parents are around and Father is on his deathbed, he's curious if his parents will come together to try and find him. Either way, with both of these methods, I could see Fallout 4's quest progression largely remaining similar to what we got in the final game. So you would still go to Concord to meet Preston, then you'd go to Diamond City, then to Good Neighbor, and finally to Fort Hagen to fight and confront Kellogg. Eventually, just the one character or both of them would reach the Institute and meet Father, only to discover that the Institute's director is their long-lost son, Sean. In my opinion, having Nora live could have affected Fallout 4's plot in some interesting ways. For example, if it was Nate that was ultimately released from the vault while Nora remains, once Nate reaches the Institute, he could discover that he has the ability to free his wife. However, in exchange, he has to do a bunch of things for the Institute. Many of these things might be amoral and could be things that the player's spouse might not approve of. So the player has to choose between saving his wife by doing a bunch of bad or morally reprehensible things for the Institute, or to simply leave his wife in the vault. And for that latter situation, maybe just before the Institute is destroyed, the player gains the access codes to release their spouse from Father and quickly transmits them before the Institute is nuked. Having the player's spouse appear this way could give context to the player's actions once they had finally completed their journey. One complaint that many people had with Fallout 4 at launch was that you never really felt evil, and I would say that's because there is little context given to the player's actions, save for the fact that your companion may either like or dislike whatever it is that you did. Having Nora as a potential NPC, in addition to the companions, would have let the player know if the things that they did were good or bad. Plus, Fallout 4 on that end could have a good or bad ending for each faction, like we've seen in previous Fallout games like Fallout New Vegas. In the second scenario, where both characters lived, much of the plot could remain unchanged. However, there would have also been the opportunity for both Nate and Nora to split up to accomplish various tasks. Think of something that you might see in Grand Theft Auto 5, where your player character can switch during just one mission. For example, during the jewel store heist before you meet Trevor, the player will rob the jewelry store as Michael. However, during the actual getaway, the player transitions to Franklin and then back to Michael. Perhaps Fallout 4 could have had a similarly designed mission, provided that both Nate and Nora survived the vault. And maybe a good example would be when either the Railroad, Minutemen, or Brotherhood attack the Institute during nuclear option. Maybe Nate performs the assault, while Nora performs the initial infiltration, or vice versa. Or during the Railroad quest, Rocket's Red Glare, Nate flies the Vertibird, while Nora's the one to actually get on the Pridwin and plant the bombs. Ultimately though, having both Nate and Nora survive would have allowed the developers at Bethesda Game Studios to make both characters playable, and it would be cool if you could switch between both characters on the fly, like you can in GTA 5 with Michael, Trevor, and Franklin. Maybe you want to play as Nate for one mission, you can do that, and then in the next mission, you can then play as Nora. In my opinion, that would be pretty cool. At the same time, I do think there are a few downsides to Nora's survival. One downside to having Nora or Nate live would be that neither could be called the sole survivor. All of the Fallout games thus far, even the ones developed by Interplay, have signature player characters that are prophetic. In Fallout 1, you have the Vault Dweller. In Fallout 2, you're the Chosen One. In Tactics, you're the Warrior. In Fallout 3, you're the Lone Wanderer. In New Vegas, you're the Courier. And in Fallout 4, you are the sole survivor. And these names are great and memorable because they form the basis of a prophecy. And in Fallout 4, it's up to the sole survivor to appear in the Commonwealth and save it from the Institute, or to help bring some semblance of peace by becoming the Institute's new leader. If Nora were to survive, the player can no longer fulfill this prophecy. Plus, the idea that one person can change the course of history makes for a much better story rather than it being two or more people. After all, being the chosen one is better than being one of the chosen. It's also important to mention that Nate or Nora's death does have some significance to the plot. The whole reason the player wants to confront Kellogg is not only because they want to find their son Sean, but also because Kellogg killed the player's spouse. If Nora does live, there's less incentive to kill Kellogg when you do finally confront him. And it's also worth mentioning that after the Battle of Bunker Hill, Father mentions that he released you from the vault as a sort of experiment. From there, he also implies that he had positioned Kellogg in a way that would make the sole survivor want to go after them. Ultimately, it worked, and the sole survivor got his or her revenge on Kellogg. And if both Nate and Nora survived, I think it's more likely that you still might confront Kellogg. However, I suspect that the exchange would be a lot different, possibly even to the point where you can make peace with Kellogg. After all, there's not much reason in trying to defeat Kellogg if he just puts you to sleep. Still, I think the two negatives I mentioned about Nora or Nate's survival as your spouse could be fixed if the game was designed with it in mind. There's also the technical gameplay advantages that come with Nora surviving Vault 111. While I can't claim to know all of Bethesda Game Studios' plans, I suspect that at one point in development that the intention may have been to create a Fallout game with an optional cooperative mode. If you think about it, if Nora simply lives and isn't killed during the beginning of the game, you could basically justify Fallout 4 as a cooperative experience. While developers are always cryptic, Todd Howard may have actually been slightly serious in an interview with Mashable where he says, quote, "Believe it or not, every time we do a game, we design a multiplayer mode just to see what we would do," which is then followed by, quote, "Then we go, yep, we shouldn't do that. That's an awesome idea that is way too distracting from the main thing that we want to do, which is single player, and then of course this is followed by I could see ways it would work, but development-wise, they're very different experiences. While this is speculation on my part, it's possible that Fallout 4 was possibly designed with co-op in mind. After all, Fallout 4 does take some inspiration from some looter-shooter type games like Borderlands and even Destiny, and there may have been some impetus to create a game where you could have both a single player as well as a cooperative experience. If a cooperative mode was implemented, it's possible that the settlement system would have been scrapped. In fact, it is possible that the decision to add a settlement system could have been what ended up killing off the potential cooperative system that Bethesda may or may not have been working on. While I'm not a game developer, it does seem like figuring out a way to enable crafting and the settlement system with co-op in Fallout 4 could have presented its own set of challenges. While I suppose Minecraft is able to do it, Fallout 4 is based off of an engine that was originally put together with the sole intention of creating a single-player focused experience. Plus, it also seems like you would have to save your entire game world, and that could present some issues for co-op, especially since you would need to figure out a way to address if one person completed a quest early compared to the other, and things like that. At the same time, having both Nate and Nora would have probably enriched the settlement system if Bethesda had gotten it all to work, especially since Minecraft allows multiple people to work together to build an object. At the end of the day, keeping Nora alive could have created a variety of opportunities. I could see ways in which the game would benefit, and while there are certainly some issues with having Nora or Nate as your spouse live, I think quite a number of those things could be remedied with a couple of clever story changes by Bethesda themselves. I also think that the developers of Bethesda could come up with another prophetic name, like the Soul Survivor, that makes sense within the context of both Nora or Nate as your spouse surviving. Maybe they could simply be called The Chosen, or both members of the pair could have their own names, with Nate being called one thing and Nora being called something else. What fascinates me is that Fallout 4 could have potentially been a multiplayer game, and in some ways, I wonder if the developers over at Bethesda simply rewrote the script to where only Nate or Nora ends up surviving the Great War and the cryopods in Vault 111. Having both characters live could make for a great co-op experience from a technical and gameplay perspective. That said, would I want multiplayer co-op like we've seen in games like Borderlands or Destiny? No. What arguably makes Fallout unique is that it's a single-player experience. But I do know that I'd like to see more content that expands on or modifies the story of Fallout 4 in some interesting ways. Until then, I suppose we will just have to enjoy some mods that add Nora back into the game, or just wait for the very next Fallout game. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.